Degrowth, on the one hand, attracted a lot of attention with this term. If they would have used another term, it wouldn't have reached this fame. But with that term, you can also not go in politics. There's no political party that dares to use that term. No political party.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we build a robust, credible argument for conserving nature and its biodiversity, which sometimes requires us to re-examine conventional wisdom. I'm your host, Andre Mardo. Few ideas are as deeply embedded in how we run our societies as economic growth. Across the political spectrum, growth is treated as self-evidently good, and the debate tends to be a tug-of-war between those who want to keep growing and those who argue we urgently need to do the opposite. Degrowth is the argument that wealthy societies should deliberately shrink their economies to stay within the planet's limits. Most of us can probably sense that there's no end to the expansion of human activity and that something has to give. But how well does degrowth actually hold up when you examine the evidence behind it? And is it a realistic strategy or just missing the point? My guest is Jeroen van den Bergh, a research professor at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona and at VU University Amsterdam, and one of the sharpest critics of the degrowth movement. But as you'll hear, he's an equally sharp critic of growth at all costs. In 2024, he published a widely discussed review of the degrowth literature that concluded much of it is built on conviction rather than rigorous research, a verdict that earned plenty of pushback. In this conversation, we dig into the appeal of degrowth, the reasons why it's politically radioactive, and what a more evidence-based approach to growth and environment might look like. I began by asking Jeroen about his long-standing proposal to move beyond the entire growth versus degrowth debate. He calls it A-growth and describes it as an agnostic stance towards economic growth, meaning we should stop treating GDP growth as a policy goal in itself and be indifferent to whether it rises or falls, focusing instead directly on social and environmental priorities like well-being.
The reason to be in favor of A-growth is quite simple, actually, and I'm surprised that other people didn't see it before, because there is now broad agreement, both in economics and beyond economics, in environmental science and the social sciences, that GDP, the unit of economic growth, is not a good measure of social welfare or human societal progress. And therefore, we better ignore that indicator and focus on relevant indicators. And if you ignore that indicator, then you're no longer interested in what GDP does. Does it go up? Does it go down? Does it stay constant? Is it fluctuating? So you become disinterested in growth. You ignore growth, in fact. So it's just a logical step from realizing that GDP is not a good measure of progress. And I have to also say that this holds especially true, of course, for the rich countries, because for the very poor countries in the world, we know there's a high correlation between improving basic life conditions for people and economic growth. But for the rich countries, we don't see that connection very much anymore. And so there's another fundamental issue, namely that this debate on growth or anti-growth, green growth, believing in green growth or not, is a debate about truth. What is the truth? And that's a normal scientific way to approach things. Is it possible to have green growth or not? And I started off in the debate like that as well. I was also interested, like, is it possible? Is it not possible? But I've realized after a while that you cannot answer that question, because what can we do to inform ourselves about the possibility of growth? We can look at the past, but we know that the future has to look very different from the past if we want to achieve sustainability. So the past is a bad informer about the future. In the past, we didn't have good environmental policies or climate policies. We still don't have them. In the future, we need to have them if we want this planet to survive in a nice way for humans. And so the future looks very different. And from an empirical perspective, even if you use all the data you have, you can just not say with certainty if green growth is possible or not. It's an unanswerable question, in my view. Mm-hmm. And that's another reason for me, from a scientific perspective, to say, okay, I cannot answer that question. Anything I say with certainty about growth is possible or not, green growth is possible or not. I don't have a scientific basis for that. I find that unscientific. And a lot of my colleagues do it. They're optimistic or pessimistic and also unscientific in my view. And I just say, I don't know, I could be positive. I could have reasons to be positive. I could have reasons to be pessimistic. But overall, it's difficult. And there's maybe a third way also, because if you talk about green growth, you talk about the concept of decoupling income or growth from environmental pressure. And that means basically decoupling money from physical entities. Well, we can in principle do that. How much? I don't know. But if you see how many miniature technologies we have, if you look at the mobile phone, it's amazing what it can do nowadays. And it doesn't weigh a lot. You could, of course, object and say there's a lot of toxic metals, there's a lot of scarce metals there. Okay, but still, if we go in that direction more, maybe there's more to gain. I'm not particularly optimistic, but I'm also not pessimistic in that sense. And so all these uncertainties for me are also a reason to say you cannot have a scientific position there. A growth is the best position, basically.
So many things there that I wanted to pick up on, but just the last one there, that decoupling that you've spoken about is essentially the free market environmentalism argument, right? This idea that we can and we have been successful in some instances in decoupling progress from resource utilization and waste, right? But what you're saying is that is also irrelevant in this discussion. And I guess also along with that, this idea that, I mean, GDP is right at the center of this, right? GDP and growth or green growth or degrowth are all intermingled. And GDP is the core of that, as far as I understand, this idea that growth is tied to this one metric. Maybe I can just pause there to make sure that I'm understanding so far.
I wouldn't say it's a free market argument necessarily, because to be able to decouple, you need very good policies also. So it's a mixture of markets, technological innovation, maybe other types of innovation also, but especially technological, I think. But policy is essential also, because the market itself doesn't do enough. Even innovation doesn't do enough, because innovation is very much focused on profit making. And that's also a problem for the environment, because, for instance, the mobile phone got a lot of innovation funding because the benefits were clear to people, and therefore the value of investing in that was secure. But investing in renewable energy is less attractive because the electricity that comes out of your wall is the same. It doesn't make your machines run faster or more efficient or with fewer errors. So if you have to pay more for it, it becomes less attractive. And so there is less of a commercial gain to be made. And that's why we need environmental policies, climate policies, renewable energy policies. So I would not reduce it to the market. It's really market, innovation, and policy, that triangular that is essential to steer in the right direction.
Right.
Maybe I can also answer the first question, because you had a second part of the question. How do we make the world better? Well, as I said already, I don't think it makes sense to try to resolve the question, is green growth possible or not? So A growth has a different entrance in that debate. It's not trying to solve that question. What it really can do is reduce political resistance against good policies. Not only climate policies, environmental policies, also social policies, equity policies. So these policies usually don't work out very well in GDP terms, because it means you have to interfere in the market. You need to redistribute income and wealth. You need progressive taxes on incomes. And so we know from economics that may go at the cost of efficiency and growth. So there is a trade-off. And if GDP dominates, the trade-off falls out badly for the environment and for social outcomes. So if you can reduce the preoccupation that people have and politicians have, but citizens and voters too, with economic growth, then it will be easier to sell policies that might harm growth because people are less concerned about it. But now there's always the concern about growth. Any policy has to survive the growth test. And in my world of A growth, that test is no longer necessary. Then it will be a well-being test, or maybe a beyond GDP test. Maybe that's another discussion. I'm also open to replacing the GDP with a corrected GDP that corrects for inequality, for informal economy, for environmental damage, and so on. And then that indicator might be used maybe as a surrogate progress indicator. But the current GDP is very far removed from that. So growth is not to solve this question about is green growth possible or not. It is focused on reducing political resistance against good policies. And that, in that sense, it could make the world much better, in my view.
So if we didn't have this obsession with GDP, do you think that would change everything, or would there just be something else that we latched onto? I mean, people have spoken about the happiness index, for example, and there are other maybe less kind of creative ones that have been put forward as possible replacements to GDP. But does that change anything in terms of your growth focus, or would that change anything?
Well, for certain we can't say because we haven't tried it, but you can imagine that if GDP is no longer observed as a relevant indicator, that in that case we can focus more our attention, we can give greater weight to indicators like inequality and climate change, for instance. And if you would have a beyond GDP indicator, which would show that despite GDP growth, the beyond GDP, and we have indicators like that. For instance, there is the famous genuine progress indicator, the GPI. An earlier version is called the ISEF, the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, invented by Herman Daly. So it showed for many rich countries that since the 50s, 60s, 70s, depending on which country you look at, the US was first, that despite GDP growth, this corrected GDP didn't grow anymore. And that, if we would implement that as a relevant indicator in policy and politics, then that indicator would send a very strong message. Politicians, you are focusing on GDP growth. It doesn't improve societal well-being. There's no progress. You're focusing on the wrong thing. And in that case, you could even say, hey, forget about GDP. We have GDP plus. We have GDP 2.0 now, the corrected indicator. So I must say, over time, I've also become more and more enthusiastic about trying to get a better indicator, because ultimately decisions are made based on information. And GDP is also so powerful because it's a simple indicator. People see it as the national income, the income of us all. If you divide it by the number of people in the country, it's the average income. Why wouldn't you want to increase that? It's logical. I understand that. Yeah, but it doesn't measure all the negative aspects. It doesn't even measure all the well-being. It doesn't measure all the informal economy. And if we do something bad and we have to repair it, then it looks like a gain. We have environmental problems. They create also health problems, more hospitalization. Well, that's good for the GDP. So it works in the opposite way. Worse, bad developments are translated in seemingly progress indications. And that's not what we want.
You also mentioned earlier on, though, that GDP makes more sense when it comes to poor countries, right? So that the indicator is actually doing a better job there than it is in the rest of the world. I guess that's part of the problem, right? Like, where do you actually draw the line? Like, where does GDP stop becoming useful? And I guess there's not a clear cutoff point either.
No, there's research also on that. They've tried to establish a per capita income even, beyond which people stop getting happier. And there is no certainty on that because, well, one argument there is that people adapt. So people like the prospect of a higher income, but once they have it, they adapt to it. Not only physically, they may adapt their lifestyle, a bigger car, a bigger house, more holidays, but they get used to that also. And even if they put it in the bank, in the beginning, a higher salary per month feels nice, and then they get used to it. But it's not completely true, it turns out, because also it gives status, it gives flexibility. You can move to a better neighborhood. You have more certainty in life. You worry less about money and about the future. And we see now, even in all the rich countries in Western Europe, where I live, I mean, we've become richer and richer and richer, and housing is so expensive that for the young people, it creates stress. And politicians also don't know how to handle it. There are, I think, good solutions, but they're extremely difficult to implement also. So people don't feel rich even with high income. So it is a complicated issue. And it's understandable that people strive for more income. That's absolutely understandable. There's also not necessarily consistency with individual income increases over your lifetime and a stable GDP or a not necessarily growing GDP structurally, because you can always grow your income in an income distribution. You can go from having less experience, a beginner, a low career position to a higher career position. So people can still go through that career and have a good feeling of that. Now, the degrowth movement probably wants to move away from that and wants that we all become less aspirational in that sense, that we have a frugal lifestyle. I don't think it's realistic. That's another reason for me to be critical of degrowth. That's maybe a separate discussion worth, but I'm a realist. We have little time to solve the urgent environmental problems, climate change and biodiversity loss that we have. If we don't do it in the coming decades, then this planet undergoes a lot of damage and humans along with it. So to think about extreme experiments like changing our society drastically, moving to, away from the market economy, decentralized activities, non-market activities. I don't know. I'm skeptical. I'm not against that, but I am skeptical about that in any case.
Well, that's a good transition to the next question, actually, which was to focus a little bit on this 2024 paper of yours, which I gather attracted quite a lot of attention and again, sort of quite a lot of opposition, I think, from different sides, often polar opposite sides. And my understanding is that you found that studies on degrowth are overwhelmingly opinion-based. There's sort of commentaries, right, in the literature with a fairly limited amount of empirical studies. And I also heard that the empirical studies that you looked at were mostly quite flawed. I hope that's not a mischaracterization of your results. Perhaps you can just briefly summarize, what you found. Maybe just put into more eloquent words what I just tried to summarize there.
So we did a study in which we searched for articles that had titles which used the term degrowth or post-growth written in different ways. Then we cleaned the data. I think we found more than 1,200 studies initially. We cleaned the data. There were a lot of irrelevant studies also because the term seems to be used in chemistry even. So then we arrived at more than 500 studies. And then we looked at those. Indeed, most were opinion papers. Some were write out pamphlets, not very scientific. But that was really not our criticism. It was more a neutral object commentary. But in the press, it was seen as the main criticism. But in my view, the main insights that we obtained was that there were very few empirical studies, very few model studies, very few hard data. And also the studies that we looked at, the models were very ad hoc. So they had little connection with existing models. So they were not building upon good habits. And in science, to move forward means standing on the shoulders of the good researchers of the past. That's exactly what science does well. And that's also a major weakness of degrowth. There's a little bit element of arrogance, like you've done it all wrong, we'll do it better now. You feel that a lot. That fits also this big picture, this fundamental criticism, everything is wrong and we know it better. And they know very little. Most people who write there know very little about relevant research. So they can also not take good ideas from others. I noticed that. They reinvent the wheel, do it in an ad hoc way. And then there's a lot of studies that have a very limited scale, so very small scale studies, doing surveys in one company, in one organization, that you have to ask the question like, yeah, but what's the relevance? How representative is this? Can you upscale these findings easily? Many studies also done for islands. How representative is an island for the complexity of a country and countries interacting? So from all these perspectives, we came out quite negative. And a final comment that I would like to make is that on the one hand, degrowth literature has very big ideas about we need to change society fundamentally, lifestyles have to be changed, consumerism has to be removed, and so on. On the other hand, they talk also about policies, and these policies they also invent. So they come with policies like universal basic income, free transport, work time reduction, etc., etc. Now, most of these policies have hardly seen any serious research. So we are groping in the dark about what are the implications of these. And you can imagine universal basic income, if you implement that wide scale, that has a huge impact, but we don't know for sure what.
Mm-hmm.
And they believe in it and without any research. Should we really invest as a society in a risky project without knowing much about it? That's not the scientific way to move forward. So because of it, and it's interesting also, if you looked at all the papers that had concrete policy advice, it was never based on that paper. So what happened is that paper did analysis, and then there was an afterthought about policy. And then they had their own opinions and they had interesting stories sometimes, but it was not really based on the research done in that paper. This was very common. And so overall, I found almost no papers that had a serious policy analysis out of more than 500 studies. So yeah, that made me quite skeptical, I have to say.
This might be a little bit of a side question, but did you have any sense of who was writing, especially the commentaries? I mean, was it mostly people who were qualified to do so, environmental economists, or were you finding that sort of everybody was just weighing in the peer-reviewed literature and wanting to have their say about this without really much to back it up?
I think the degrowth scientific community is very much dominated by social sciences like sociology, maybe Marxist economists, social geographers. For instance, psychologists. There were a few studies. There were also a few studies about what the support is, or what support you can expect for degrowth ideas. And yeah, there was hardly anything, but there were 2 or 3 studies from psychologists, and they were very critical. Psychologists do several quick surveys or experiments, and they found that people were afraid of the term degrowth. It sounded very harsh and negative. And this is also my view a little bit, that degrowth, on the one hand, attracted a lot of attention with this term. If they would have used another term, it wouldn't have reached this fame. But with that term, you can also not go in politics. There's no political party that dares to use that term, no political party. And now some of the main people in degrowth, they have papers and projects that use the term post-growth, which I find a bit dishonest, because post-growth is wider, it's more open. I think A-growth is certainly also post-growth. So sometimes I have to say there are 2 types of post-growth, A-growth and degrowth. It's fine that they can do that, but it's also a bit dishonest. I would never think of using another term like A-growth because I can defend it well. But they realized also, one of them also said to me, I think maybe degrowth should only be used in academic articles and not in the communication with politics and society. Maybe we should use post-growth only then. Yeah, but then it's confusing, because if you want then to refer to degrowth, you cannot do that really, or there's an inconsistency. Yeah?
Right, and there's no clear division between the peer-reviewed literature and the policy-aimed literature, right? In fact, there are plenty of journals that are specifically designed to bridge that gap.
Yeah, there's also a group of people, I think, who are not really scientific, but who are really enthusiastic about the idea of degrowth. And so they also enter in some journals with very pamphletic type of articles. And some of them also, when we published this article, it got so much attention on Twitter, then some people responded to me and with very emotional reactions. They didn't see that we are out for the same goal. We want to solve problems. It's I'm a scientist. I love to analyze concepts and techniques and indicators and then say, I don't think it's good enough. It could be better,
Those degrowth studies, were there some of them which were anti-degrowth, which were sort of looking at degrowth, but whether they were opinion pieces or empirically based, they were actually kind of critiquing the concept rather than trying to support it?
Oh, yeah. Now, there were very few people that used the word degrowth. I don't know. It's a good question. Because I also checked if my own paper was in the database finally, because a colleague of mine did the technical statistical work. He looked at all of them. I looked at all the method studies. So I should have to ask him if he knows. But I don't remember having discussed with him that there were other criticisms.
Right.
Maybe because people used other titles and didn't use degrowth, or used another term in it,
Yeah, no, just a bit of an aside, but I was just curious. But so to get back to the second part of that question, which I don't think I've asked yet, which was, so you guys discovered that this body of research doesn't really meet normal research standards. But my devil's advocate question there would be, doesn't the same go for green growth and even A growth, your concept?
Well, regarding green growth, I think there is a lot of research on decoupling or delinking, which is empirical in nature. And I think it's solid, it's good. For instance, one branch of that research is known as the environmental Kuznets curve, because Kuznets is a Nobel Prize winner in economics who discovered an inversely U-shaped curve between GDP and inequality. So countries see if they start off to grow, poor countries, they see inequality increase because a small part of the population gets most benefits from growth. But then all the incomes start to rise, democracy also develops in the slipstream of that, and then policies are implemented like progressive income taxation, wealth taxation maybe, and so then you reach the top of the curve and then inequality goes down. And the same observation was made for many environmental indicators, and that's where the environmental Kuznets curve came from. But these studies, they looked at individual indicators and not at the big picture, the whole environmental problem, because what you get often is that, okay, one problem may go better, but maybe there's a shift to another problem. And so it's much more complicated. And to study a complex of indicators or an aggregate indicator is much more difficult. But in general, I think the research I wouldn't say the research is always perfect, but there is a lot of good research there. There's also a lot of modeling research to see, can we decouple in the future? Is green growth possible in the future? Now, these models can be criticized, but at least they're very explicit about their assumptions. There are different styles of models, macroeconomic models, input-output models, system dynamics models. There's now also a new generation of agent-based models. So I think altogether, I would say you can criticize any field of research, but there is much more quality research there than there is on the degrowth side. But at the same time, as I said already before, that research is, in my view, incapable of answering the question, is green growth really possible? Therefore, for me, whether the quality may be higher on the green growth side than on the degrowth side, they can't solve the fundamental question. And therefore, from a scientific perspective, A growth is the more logical position still, in my view.
And then with A growth, I mean, my understanding is that the concept is understood and respected in the tight circles around your field, but obviously it hasn't taken off in the way that degrowth has taken off. But what does the body of research look like behind A growth? I mean, are there other scholars who have sort of tried to get involved in that field?
The first question is, what kind of research is needed for A growth? Because as I said, A growth is really a logical step from the idea that GDP is not a good measure of societal welfare or progress. And if you ignore that, then automatically you want to be ignorant about GDP movements, about GDP growth, about economic growth. So that's it. There's not more to it. It's that simple. So A growth is a logical consequence of realizing that GDP is not a good indicator to focus on. And therefore, you don't need to research for that. I've already said also that you cannot solve this question whether green growth is possible or not. If green growth would be possible, I, as a person who believes really genuinely in A growth, I wouldn't be happier, except maybe that it will be easier to sell to society, because if we can sell something as a win-win outcome, it's always politically easier. We know that. Degrowth is a win-lose outcome for many people. Not for the degrowth people. They think living simpler life, you can be happier, okay, but try to sell that to the majority of people. The people who promote degrowth, working in NGOs and academic institutes, they don't live in the real world sometimes, I think. So A growth, I don't think it needs necessarily so much research, except on the political support side. And there have been studies. I started a few on my own, but there have been recently other studies. And they all find that A growth gets quite some support, more from scientists. So I think the highest percentage among scientists was even 40% of all scientists in certain surveys, which is a lot. So it was a little below green growth, and degrowth was much smaller. So in almost all of the surveys, A growth comes out as getting more support than degrowth, both from citizens and from scientists. Of course, we don't use these labels. We use the ideas, and others use also the ideas. So it's not like you say, people, do you believe more in degrowth or A growth? Because that's too concrete and you have to explain these terms. So we use definitions that we feel are closest to the spirit, and you might argue that, and that's why it would be good to do more research on that. We're also doing additional research, and we find that people's perspectives on green growth are also complicated. So many people seem to give support to green growth because they like win-win, but they don't really believe it. So they pay lip service to the concept, but if they really have to choose between green and growth, they choose for growth. And they're not surprised if green growth is not possible. So yeah, who really believes in green growth? I wonder sometimes, but it's extremely difficult to find out through surveys. And also degrowth, but also green growth is the biggest hump. So more than half of the people, more than half of the scientists often are in favor of green growth. But that's not a homogeneous group. There are people there who are in favor of growth no matter what. They're willing to sacrifice anything. There are really people who believe that growth will solve everything. And there's also people who see it more negatively. They say that, okay, if we won't have growth, we have a problem. Our society cannot handle that we don't have growth. And I can understand that position also. I can understand that. So there's people who say you don't want a situation without growth because you have political problems. And that explains also why both left-wing and right-wing moderate political parties, they want growth. The left wing is not different than the right wing. Socialist parties, they all, labor socialist parties, they all want growth. They never question growth. And it's difficult also because it's already so difficult for these political parties to get a majority or to make a coalition. Politics is difficult everywhere. There's many more political parties. Everything is fragmented. And so if you take a very extreme position on growth, that's too risky. No political party will use that strategy, I think. And so from a political perspective, green growth is likely to get support in the near future, I think. And A growth is already a huge paradigm shift. So degrowth would be an impossible paradigm shift. A growth may be impossible. I can see that. But at least I'm willing to fight for it.
Degrowth strikes me as one of those concepts which the more closely you look at it and the more you unpick it and the more you sort the wheat from the chaff, the more difficult or unlikely it becomes, right? I mean, I guess you've pretty much made that clear. I was going to ask you, what explains the appeal of degrowth? And obviously it does appeal to a lot of people. But at the same time, you've made it also clear that it's not a very popular concept among the broader world population, right? Even in developed countries. So in developing countries, I mean, it must be extremely unpopular. So I'm not even sure if that's a relevant question anymore, but let me ask it anyway. I mean, because there is a fairly large group of people who are pushing the concept, and it does seem to be more popular now than it was 5 or 10 years ago, right? Or that's my impression at least. So yeah, let me go back to that question. What do you think is the appeal of this concept, this very kind of risky sounding and negative sounding concept?
Yeah, well, I think degrowth focuses very much on the scale of human activity. And I think most people can see there's no end to scale increases. We see more infrastructure, more buildings, we see more cars, we see more people. So the scale of humanity is increasing. And as more traffic, more flights by plane. So the scale is absolutely an issue. And that's also why in some soft surveys, if you give people the choice, but not a difficult choice, then it seems like there's almost a majority of people who believe that that's the solution. Maybe that's also in the fact that people have the feeling we've tried a lot of environmental policies and it's not working, so it must be the scale in the end. And then people also realize everybody knows they have so many products and goods in their house. We accumulate, we buy things we never use, we have too many clothes, every one of us. So yeah, it's understandable. Bikes. I mean, from my kids still. My kids are adults, but I still have a lot of bikes here. We don't use them, so it's understandable. People see that we overconsume. So if you trigger all those ideas, we have to consume less. We have to work less. Yeah, it sounds like an effective solution. The problem is it's not an effective solution because if people would work less, then they would have more time to spend the money. And also, we see that unions don't accept in any country that people work less with lower income. The unions try to negotiate working less for the same income. That's possible sometimes because we are more efficient or because of the pressure the companies accept some profit losses. Well, if people have the same income and they have 5 more hours per week to spend it, they will spend it. And then what will happen? People will just travel more. So many of these degrowth strategies can fire back or rebound. I'm also very scared about that. Free public transport is a popular idea. It's a bad idea. In a few studies that have been done for free transport, it turns out that people just travel more. Electric vehicles. People who have an electric car use it more. People who have renewable energy, they use it more. Mm-hmm. The only way to stop all that is putting a higher price, making sure that the price is also higher. So carbon pricing. But that's something that in the degrowth community they don't talk about. And because that's not popular, it's easier to sell degrowth to a citizen, to a layperson, than to sell carbon pricing. Whereas carbon pricing is the only instrument. If we need one instrument, is carbon pricing. That will solve a lot of our problems. But carbon pricing is still not popular, and I understand why. And so another idea also that's very popular related to degrowth is overconsumption. We have to consume less. That people like that idea. We have to consume less. But if you think about it, what does that mean? It's not clear. I would say we have to consume less of things, for instance, that create a lot of CO2 emissions. But that you can only know by putting a carbon price on it. Because if I buy a car, the production of the car also creates a lot of CO2 emissions. So it should be reflected somehow in things that will alter my decision. Well, the price will do that. If a new car is more expensive because it had more emissions in production than another car, many people will go for a cheaper car and therefore avoid those emissions in the production. But saying simply you should buy fewer cars, that's not going to solve effectively the emissions problem necessarily, because it's a very bold, unprecise way to solve a very concrete problem. And that's why I'm, as a scientist, I'm not very in favor of these broad ideas. Consume less. No, that's too vague. It's far too vague. It's also not about consuming fewer kilograms or less money or less volume. No, it's really about the environmental problems that are related to it. And those are sometimes complex. And so they're not correlated necessarily with simple indicators.
But also this idea of, people should consume less is inextricably tied to behavior change, right? And that is, as I mentioned to you earlier, I think maybe before we started recording, much of my career was spent trying to figure out how can I be better at convincing people that I'm right about the environment. That's kind of what it boils down to. And, I hit a brick wall for 25 years. So, behavior change it's a big field, and I have colleagues here actually who know it better than I do. But it seems like a very difficult nut to crack. And that also kind of makes me think about, and maybe I'm going too much down a side road here, but behavior change is linked to regulation, right? Because regulation is kind of probably the main way you're going to make that happen, or at least from the top down. But because behavior change is so difficult, isn't that maybe another argument for sort of the more free market environmentalist approach? So just let things happen the way they're going to happen and, try to steer them in a minimal way with regulation rather than trying to do everything from the top.
The degrowth idea is basically we have to steer the economy in another direction, like as if you can plan the economy. So, because many people talk about planned degrowth, to separate it also from an economic crisis, which means GDP goes down, that's unplanned degrowth in a way. So they talk about planned degrowth. And that's also why some people criticize it as communism in disguise, centrally guided economies. And I think also that's a consequence of not talking about carbon pricing, because they don't talk about carbon pricing. If I talk individually to some people who support degrowth, they may give support to it, but more likely they like hard regulation. And in this sense, my view is on that Okay, we have basically four ways to regulate. One is direct regulation, standards, bans, prohibitions. Very limited, very difficult. It might work effectively if you can control everything in the economy, but if you do it only for part of the economy, which is already difficult, you may shift activities to other parts of the economy that are not regulated well. So you get rebound effects and shifting effects. But it will already be difficult, to regulate systems hard because there's a lot of lobbying involved. For instance, at the European level, regulating cars more. Germany is blocking because Germany has huge car industries, and those are the luxury cars which emit a lot. So it's extremely. At the other extreme, you have subsidies and information provision. Information provision is very soft; it's not very effective. Subsidies are also not so effective because they only apply to very few categories of goods. We've seen them for electric vehicles. Most of that went to the rich households, and we've seen them for solar PV. Also went to the rich households, and people would often have done it anyway. So you don't make so many changes as you think. Once there is a critical number of solar PV in a certain neighborhood, most people copy that behavior. So it's not gonna solve the problem either. What is gonna solve and what is politically the easiest, though not easy, is pricing. Pricing is a little bit in between hard regulation and flexibility. The flexibility of information provision. It's a good incentive. It's not too limiting. It fits a liberal society very much. So I think pricing has the future. There's no doubt for it. And I could make a longer storyline. It has to work through carbon markets or cap and trade, because then you have the cap, which is very consistent with the goals, the targets that we have set ourselves within the Paris Agreement, and the carbon budget that's derived from the temperature targets. Also, carbon markets are extremely good in dealing with bounded rationality, with rebound, with economic growth, that all push emissions upward. Because as long as you're not within the ceiling, it will push up the price until some emissions are reduced and you stay within the cap. And nobody has to intervene, no government has to intervene, no political decisions are necessary. So I think it has the future, and Europe is the good example. The EU has that system, and it's the most effective climate policy worldwide, without any doubt.
So you think it's essentially working?
It is, absolutely. It's not reducing emissions as we want, but it's also because if we wouldn't have that system, emissions would grow much more. And also at the world level, the European Union is now 7% of emissions. It's nothing. Europe is a small player at the world level. And maybe 15 or 20 years ago, Europe had like 15% of emissions. Now it's already 7%, because Europe has reduced its emissions and other parts of the world have increased their emissions terribly. So even if Europe does a lot, it won't contribute to a solution very much. The solution has to spread across the world. The only way to move forward.
Just one additional question, which was this idea of, whether the whole degrowth or maybe a whole growth debate has been a productive use of the environmental movement's energy or not, or has it been productive, or has it drawn attention away from other more pressing environmental priorities? Do we need to keep on focusing on this, or is it a bit of a red herring? And maybe you can also mention if A growth helps with that.
Yeah, there has been a lot published on this debate. People keep being involved in this debate. So why is that we're making progress? As I said, you can see there's a wasteful debate. If you agree with me that you cannot solve this question, is green growth feasible or not? It's an unanswerable question. But as you started also this whole podcast, people like to see the bigger picture. My students often say that the class in which we have the growth debate, and then I also do a student growth debate, they love that because they feel everything comes together and all their insights they can use in one way or another, or they're being forced to see the total of all their insights. So what does it deliver? What is now the impact of all these things we've learned? What is the ultimate conclusion? That is what the growth debate is a little about. It's a little bit about connecting the ultimate means and the ultimate ends. I'm referring now again to the language that Herman Daly, who wrote a lot about economic growth, he used that. And we are trying to move more to indicators that capture the ultimate ends. About the ultimate means, we're not sure. In fact, the debate has changed because in the 70s, with the Limits to Growth report by the Club of Rome, the debate was very much about scarce resources also. Then it moved more towards biodiversity and climate. And now again, with a big investment in electric vehicles and solar PV, the resources are back in the picture again, you know? They're scarce resources, rare earth metals. Also, they're very unequally distributed across the planet.
Geopolitics of it all.
Yeah, geopolitics. China sits on a lot of them. Europe is in the worst position, it seems. So it's an interesting issue too, and that element comes back in the debate too. And then there's the complicated aspect also of shifting environmental problems. So solving one problem, shifting another. So some people say green growth is possible, and then they refer to the fact that we can move away from CO2 emissions by investing a lot in renewable energy. But of course, there is the problem that there are other environmental issues, and they may worsen over time because exactly of that renewable strategy. So if you want to see this bigger picture, it becomes very complex. Then you can invoke all those planetary boundaries, these 9 planetary boundaries, some of which are rather abstract for social scientists, some of which are also difficult to measure at the global scale or to aggregate. So it's a complicated debate, and it also forces you to be modest, in my view. And that's why I think, again, A-growth is a step forward. It recognizes that you cannot answer certain questions, that you have to be modest about that. But that's also not a problem, because the ultimate reason to worry about growth issues is that they form a barrier in the political process. The reason why I am concerned about the growth debate is that people use the growth argument to not implement good policies, whether social policies or environmental policies. So for me, it's more about political support and political feasibility. And not everybody or most people don't see it like that. But at least from my perspective, this whole growth debate in which I've been involved a little bit has clarified my mind. And I've seen that other people like my perspective. It's not growing so radically fast as degrowth, but it has a slow growth curve. I think it's doing okay. But I think in any case, it's certainly a broadening of the growth debate. Herman Daly, for instance, who I respect tremendously, in whose work I read a lot when I was a PhD student, he died a few years ago, and I had emails about it, and he said, Jeroen, you really came up with a concept that we didn't see, that we overlooked. And I compliment you on it. And he also said he could support it. And because Herman Daly is often put in the corner of degrowth, but he was also critical of degrowth. He thought it was too ideological, too little concrete, pragmatic. So he didn't want to associate himself with degrowth also. He was also careful to embrace A-growth completely, I have to say, because he, of course, had such a long career. But he was, in any case, he was very positive about it.
This makes me think that, there seems to be this division between the marketability of ideas and the degree to which those ideas are anchored to evidence and truth, and unfortunately those two don't always overlap, right? And I find that very often when you start digging into these things, you start finding the flaws in them. And the problem with that is that if you can find them, then other people can also find them. The point is that, these concepts are used to promote conservation or environmentalism, but they're flawed concepts. They haven't been thought through properly, and a bunch of people have taken them and run with them and used them for political means, successfully so. But when things start unraveling, then all credibility unravels with it, so.
Yeah, you better use a concept that can create more support because it's more robust, and maybe then you can change the world, but you're not going to change the world faster than me with your degrowth concept necessarily, unless you think that degrowth is just necessary to make people more afraid of the environmental future. Could be.
That's what worries me, is that these concepts, some of them are almost purely or majority political concepts and not truth-based concepts. I don't know what's a better way to put it, but truth-based or evidence-based concepts. The thing is that most people don't have the time to really look carefully and understand them. They just sort of think, okay, these guys said degrowth is the way to go. I agree with the general idea. Yes, we should consume less, as you were saying earlier on. So, let's
Right,
trust the experts and then go with it. And I guess that's also why the experts got so upset with you, is because you were sort of exposing the fact that they're a little bit untethered from the evidence.
Your last question is about, let's say, has it been a productive use? Has it drawn attention away from other issues? Well, first of all, I think it's good to have this growth debate, but also realize that ultimately, what is the goal of environmental science and environmental politics is to get good policies implemented. That should be the target. And I'm very much focused on environmental and climate policy in particular. And I see that growth is a barrier. So that's my motivation. It's not growth per se. And I'm not obsessed with growth at all. I am obsessed with the fact that we don't implement the policies that are the best according to science. And that's because they don't get support. So then maybe you have to trade off a little bit, or you have to sell them more cleverly, or you have to reduce resistance in a certain way. So, and I feel this is one way to reduce resistance. So that's why, for me, also growth and climate policy are very much connected. And that's I have a big project on that. So my current surveys that I do try to establish the link at the individual level between opinions on growth and opinions on climate policies and instruments and specific details. Nobody has done that. So I'm trying to see a specific connection between that. Haven't published yet, but we have now done the first survey. We're planning a few more. So in the coming year, probably we will have some publications on that topic, and that's really exciting. So there's also A growth, degrowth, green growth play a role there, and then we connect it to what people think about climate policies, and we also try to assess their grand perspectives, but we also try to identify how they think about a lot of specific issues related to growth. So we don't want to put people in simple corners. We want to know more subtle aspects about their views. And then another thing that I want to say is that the debate is also continuing along the lines of beyond GDP. And everybody seems to be agreed. Beyond GDP, and it's a good concept. But if you look at the details, there's disagreement there as well. There's not a good debate in my view. So many people there, they believe very much in dashboards of indicators like the Sustainable Development Goals. But these approaches have not weakened the role of GDP in the political process at all. And in fact, we've always had dashboards, even at the macroeconomic scale. If you see the macroeconomic debate has always been fed with information about inflation, unemployment, and GDP, exchange rates before the integration in many countries in a larger body. So it's not true that GDP was the only indicator in town. There were other indicators, but nevertheless, GDP was on the throne. Bob Costanza has an article in Nature that once said, we have to dethrone the GDP. And I agree with that. And we're not doing that with these indicators that add to GDP. Many people believe in that. I'm also quite a loner in that area, not completely alone. Many economists think like me. But in the statistical world, people don't like aggregate indicators. So they want many indicators. They forget that the goal of beyond GDP is to get rid of the dominance of GDP. But they don't seem to care. So there is an ongoing debate still about this issue. What is the best approach? And I strongly favor GDP 2.0 because I can see that we don't get rid of GDP unless there is a corrected GDP. Because if you have a corrected GDP, then in any political or scientific debate, when someone talks about GDP, you say, wait a minute, you're talking about GDP 2.0, just to be sure. No, okay, then you're old-fashioned. And we cannot say that right now. We just cannot say. You can say, have you looked at the SDGs? Yeah, which one? Yeah, one of the 180, or how many are there? I don't know. It just doesn't work. But there is disagreement on this. Even in my research team, we're having debate. The United Nations just brought out a report by a high-level committee on this. And they seem also a little bit divided because they on the one hand, they say indicate many indicators. And on the other hand, they also argue that maybe an additional aggregate corrected GDP, an inclusive GDP would be a good idea as well. So it seems that in the committee there might have been disagreement also,
Next time, I'm joined by Esther Turnhout, Professor of Science, Technology and Society at the University of Twente, to question something we usually take for granted, the idea that science describes the world objectively and leaves the deciding to policymakers. We focus mostly on conservation science and how tools like assessments, indicators, and models can quietly shape what counts as conservation worthy in the first place. We talk about what tends to go wrong when scientists, policymakers, and communities try to work together, and whether bodies like the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, can succeed in bringing plural knowledge systems together. I hope you'll join us.